delighted to be able to host Mr. Ajay Banga, who currently serves in the chair of the International Chamber of Commerce, one of the largest chambers of bringing in together all industries from different parts of the globe. And in fact, his association with ICC is over a long time. He was the first vice chair of ICC in the year 2018. And in his professional realm, he is the executive chairman of Mastercard and a member of the board of directors of that organization. And prior to Mastercard, he served as the chief executive officer of the Citigroup Asia Pacific region and served as a member of President Obama's Commission in Enhancing National Cybersecurity. And he was a past member of the US President's Advisory Committee for Trade Policy and Negotiation. He's also a member of the board of overseers of the Weill Council Medical College, and is the director of the Dow Inc., a member of its compensation and governance committees. So for the next 20 minutes or so, he will be in conversation with Mr. Dinesh Weerakkody, who serves as the chairman of ICC Sri Lanka. Here we go.
Hi Ajay, great to have you on this webinar. Let me start by asking you what your prognosis is for the world economy for the next 6 months.
Well, thank you, and Dinesh, and thank you for having me, and greetings everybody. It's wonderful to get a chance to connect with the community in Sri Lanka. Look, I think we are living through a really difficult time in a number of countries, and while I'm relatively optimistic about the United States today compared to where I was, let's say, 6 months ago, because the spread of vaccination and the opening up of the domestic economy and the level of fiscal and monetary injections that are going in, I have a relatively good view of where the US economy will go over the next couple of years. But that's not uniformly the case around the world. And we've got disparities between developing countries and developed countries, and even within developed countries, a lot of disparities based on the spread of vaccinations and the relative opening of the economy. So I think this is a challenging time, Dinesh, and we must understand that. Now, the second aspect is that what has happened during the pandemic is that digitization has become a common word for everybody. Digital usage, the acceptance of digital technology has become a big part of what we're all doing. Look at us talking today. You would rarely have thought of doing something like this entirely remotely, but we are. And so that seems to have become our new normal. Although, as I can see in the US with opening up, people are very quickly coming, the pendulum is swinging back to somewhere in between on physical versus digital. But it's there. Coming with this is a digital divide. And I think we've got to be careful about that. A K-shaped recovery, where if you're an SME or a student who doesn't have access to the broadband or infrastructure or affordability that comes with the internet, you are creating a fairly long-term challenge for equity in an economy. So I think I'm optimistic about the economy. I'm optimistic about the recovery. I'm a little worried about this digital divide. And then the last point, and then I'll move on from this, is my concern about what has been exhibited in this point of an absence of global leadership. It really became everybody for themselves in the pandemic. And the Bretton Woods institutions didn't work. The global leadership didn't work. G7, G20 didn't really work that well. I think that's a problem. And we need to think about what comes next and how do we navigate through this next period, because the global institutions need to come together. This is not the only pandemic that we will go through. So I think those are the three little things that we need to watch out for.
Thank you. Given the importance of Asia, what is your take on the investment climate in Asia post-2022?
Well, I think Asia remains just mission critical. When you have a continent which, if you go all the way from Japan to India, is home to half the world's population, basically, give or take a little, right? And is home to very large, sort of economically sound markets, China, ASEAN, the developed countries of Australia and Japan. This is not markets in a powerhouse growing in India. These are markets that the world ignores at their peril. So my sense is that if we can get vaccinations to become adequately available across the Asian system over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, and I'm beginning to be a little more hopeful now with the commitments of the G7 to give a lot of vaccinations into the world. And as you know, the MasterCard Foundation has made a pledge to put in 1.3 billion into Africa. So private companies, governments are all beginning to step up. I'm generally optimistic about Asia in 2022. I think 2021 will remain a little choppy because of these challenges we spoke about at the beginning.
Thank you. Moving on to your company, what are companies like MasterCard doing to reinvent itself? And my next question is there any other frontiers for credit cards?
Yeah, well, so first of all, I think there's a long way to go for electronic payments, your second question. I think it's connected to the first one. We don't care whether you pay with a credit card, a debit card, a prepaid card, or you pay with a bank account, or tomorrow you pay by rubbing your fingers together or looking into my eyes and some technology makes it happen, or you tap your forehead. I think people get all excited about the form factor. But the actual point is not the form factor, it's the enabling rail. And the enabling rail is the idea of connecting billions of people with millions of merchants, with tens of millions of businesses and governments, and enabling the payment system to work. That's the MasterCard that we have been migrating towards. It's called card because it's in our name. But Apple has Apple in its name, and it doesn't sell apples. So what's in a name? And that's the main thing here. So really what we are is in the payments business, account-to-account movement of money in a safe way, in a simple way, in a less friction way, and then using the data that is generated from that to provide value-added services in cybersecurity and data analytics. That's the company that's being reinvented. I know I've been CEO for 11 years, and I just stepped down to become executive chair and handed over to a terrific guy called Michael Niebach. And you would find when I joined the company, we had a market cap of about 19 billion. It's now 360 billion. And I'm very optimistic about the future. Very.
Can you talk a little bit about people and talent, the impact the pandemic has had on people and talent in general?
Sure. I think the biggest problem with the pandemic has been twofold. One is the unequal impact on women and minorities. So if you were to look at the United States, for example, a lot of the small businesses that got impacted were owned by women and minorities because they were in hospitality, services, restaurants, trainers, theater, the roadside coffee guy, the barber. These are typically not run by other people than minorities and women. And a lot of the people they employ in these industries were also women and minorities. So there is a disproportionate impact on them, which I think is a real problem. It's part of the issue of the K-shaped recovery that we briefly referred to in response to your first question. But I think the second part has a great deal to do with when people say you could work from home. Well, half the American jobs don't work from home. If you're a hospital provider, or you're a policeman, or a fire brigade guy, or an EMV technician, or a computer technician, or a AT&T employee, or somebody of that type, or the Metropolitan Transport Authority, or a pilot, or FAA, you went to work. FedEx, UPS, Amazon, Walmart, you went to work. So when we say you could work from home, we're only talking about the educated knowledge worker, which is only half of the population of workers in the United States. So first of all, that itself tells you that it's not an equal world. And of the 50% who are able to work from home because they're in the knowledge field, the level of stress that you see on them because of working hours, the interspersing of home and office, the separation of home and office went away. So in some ways, while they found it convenient to work from home, you could work in your sweatpants and you could be a little more flexible. In actual fact, their days got backed up by one Zoom call after the other. And as you know well, a lot of young people are complaining of fatigue, are complaining of stress. And companies like ours that have set up mental well-being lines, the number of calls coming into our mental well-being lines went up. We instituted policies of Zoom-free days, meeting-free days, telling managers to give their employees gaps between meetings. So there's that aspect. The third aspect has to do with all these young people who went to college and were graduating in the period of the pandemic and finding new jobs. Can you imagine finding a job where you would never go to work for a year, but you don't even know anybody, and the only way you get to know people is on Zoom or a video call? That's not the way to build a network. That's not the way to build a social system. That's not the way to get imbibed into the culture of a company. That's not the way to become part of the family. And so I think, there were some aspects of the way we managed through this that were very flexible and very good for people. And then there are some difficult aspects. And my belief is the pendulum has swung too far. And as we are able to go back to physical work, hopefully we will come to a better place where we are more flexible as employers than we used to be, but we are not at the extreme where everybody's working at the end of a computer screen.
Excellent. You talked about a leadership deficit. What are your expectations from global leadership?
My expectations is they actually do their job. We voted them into their jobs because we expect them to provide us with the leadership. They should do their job. One of the things they have to do is certainly to look after their countries and their populations, but also to make for a better world for us and our children. How do you plan to tackle climate change without global cooperation? How do you plan to tackle the revival of global trade without global cooperation? How do you plan to tackle supply chains without global cooperation? The development of vaccines in a record time for COVID-19 would not have happened without global cooperation. How do you plan to deal with future pandemics and other such issues without global cooperation? And I think, therefore, the global system, multilateral system, the Bretton Woods institutions, they have defects. The WTO has defects. So we don't want to just recreate the old WTO. We want to create the WTO that is appropriate for our new world of data, of digital, of interconnected worlds. Young people don't look on boundaries as the boundary of their country. The boundaries for them are the boundaries of social connection. And Dinesh, we need to give them the right to their life and their world. And so my expectations of leaders is lead, show that vision and show that capability.
There was a bit of concern about the role of multilateral institutions also in the pandemic, especially IMF. Any thoughts around that?
It's not just the IMF. The IMF actually came forward with some degree of assistance, but the WHO faced struggles, right? People lost faith in the WHO's clarity of thinking. So they are now trying to build it back. So I think almost every institution of global cooperation came up short in the pandemic, partly caused by failures of leadership there, but partly caused by the failure of large countries and important countries to agree on the basic principle that we are in this together. It's an interconnected world. I cannot be safe if you, Dinesh, in Sri Lanka are not safe. It's not enough for me to do just what I want in America, because mutants and variants will come from elsewhere. I need to make sure that you are healthy and prosperous as well. We're in it together, right? And I think that's the principle that somehow needs to come back to our global leadership.
Thank you. Talking about ICC, there's a lot of talk of making ICC relevant. In terms of expectation, what is your agenda for ICC going forward?
Well, my view of the ICC is it plays an incredible role as the merchants of peace. And because trade leads to peace. When countries trade, they don't fight. When people trade, they build relationships. And relationships is equal to peace and prosperity. So now, Not everything was done right with trade. The beneficiaries of trade did not look after those who got hurt. That's a mistake. Should we have done better with retraining, with social safety nets, with new kinds of roles and opportunities and jobs? I don't think we did. But trade did reduce global poverty quite dramatically over the last 30, 40 years. And so I think the ICC's role, first, is to help to grow the economies again. We've been through a very challenging period, and that means we've got to get vaccines out there, because without vaccines, how will economies grow? You cannot open. And therefore, equitable distribution of vaccines and the effort to get vaccines into people's arms around the world is mission critical, which is why the ICC is doing so much work on a vaccine clearinghouse, as well as with COVAX and WHO and all that. Second is to help to revive global trade. And I think there's far more challenges, two types principally. One is there's a lot of local and bilateral and regional trade deals being enacted. Now, in a way, that's not bad, provided we as members of the ICC engage with those to ensure that business is well represented when people are deciding on those trade deals. But, too many regional and bilateral deals make it very hard for SMEs, Dinesh, to do global business. An SME does not have 54 employees who can change their product to suit a small change in every country. SMEs need standards, because standards create level playing fields. And level playing fields allow SMEs to do what they can do, which is make a good product and distribute it. They don't have lawyers and engineers and CFOs and treasurers, and they don't have all that. So this is a problem of balkanization of trade, which means we must help the WTO come back to some form of future prominence over the next few years. Now, hard, not easy. Ngozi is a wonderful person to be there, and we're engaging with her, as you know. But we need to get a few things done. The fisheries deal, e-commerce deals, get some quick wins, and then really work on the necessary reform in the WTO that is needed for the future of trade. And that brings me to the future of trade in data and technology. I think we need a data and technology forum, like a board of some type, comprising the regulators and leaders from the top countries of the world, so that we don't make mistakes in the future of data and technology. We cannot afford balkanized technology and balkanized data, just as we cannot afford balkanized standards in my earlier comment. Now, in the past recession, we created the Financial Stability Board of the G20, which has enabled the big countries of the world to work well together on financial systems, which is why, if you notice in this crisis, fiscal and monetary policy worked pretty well across the world. It's not by accident. It's by work and effort of the FSB. We need something like that for data and technology, maybe a data and technology board at the G20 level. I think the last part, which we cannot ignore, you feel this in a country like Sri Lanka, we cannot afford to ignore climate change. We must advance sustainability. And as businesses, it is incumbent upon us to do that. So if we're going to have new standards on ESG for big companies, the big companies are only as good as their SMEs and their supply chain. So we've got to find ways to enable SMEs to keep pace with the idea of sustainability, which is why the ICC is doing a lot of work on its climate hub and SME 360X tools that allow SMEs to be climate and sustainability compliant. So those are the three. Do something about economic growth, help to work on trade, digital and regular trade, WTO institutions, that type, help SMEs, and then really get into the sustainability chart.
Okay, thank you. I have three quick questions to close this conversation. Moving on to banks. Banks are facing fierce competition from fintech and tech giants like Amazon. What should banks do to stay relevant going forward?
Well, I think banks have to be willing to compete. They can no longer, if they believed that in the past, they can no longer believe that because they have distribution and they have balance sheets, they have strength, that they have a walled garden. They have no walled garden. Regulators are opening up the walls. And so banks have got to compete with fintechs and with retailers. And by the way, they are eminently capable of doing so. You look at banks in every country that are nimble and adapting. They're doing a great job. So, I'm very familiar, for example, you take banks in India, right? Your neighbor. Look at HDFC Bank. Nimble, competitive, digital, enabled, oriented for what the country wants to do. And guess what? It is competing. So my view is that banks can compete, but they have to provide the right capital and resources for technology and really look at the consumer and at their problem and solve that. Now, they need a level playing field with regulators. If regulators make them have a different set of regulations from what fintechs have, that's not fair, right? You have to create level playing fields.
Right. Talk a little bit about how banks can also mine the data and become more customer focused, since that's your area of expertise.
You put the customer at the center. That's how you start, right? Yeah. How do you do that? By the data. Remember, banks have enormous information, because if your bank account is in the bank, you know how much I earn, how much I spend, where I spend, how I spend. So if banks were to not only use their own data, but cooperate across institutions to be able to share data with privacy protections in a way that enables for better delivery of product and pricing for Dinesh, what is wrong with that? That is a good thing. So I think that's the idea of open banking. But open banking should be where the fintech and the retailer can take the bank's data. It has to be where the bank can also get the fintech's data and the retailer's data. So you create a level playing field, and then may the best company win. The best company wins, the consumer will win.
Talk a little bit about the challenges around cryptocurrencies as well.
Sure. I think cryptocurrencies are of three types. There's the basic asset-based ones, a bit like Bitcoin and others. There are those that they call stable coins, which are not as volatile. They connect them to some form of fiat currency, but they're still private sector issued. And then there's government issued central bank digital currency, which is a digital representation of a fiat currency. And my belief is that currencies that are volatile and floating, they're not really currencies. They're asset classes. And if you are a sophisticated investor, well, then go ahead and invest in them, but know that you could lose all your money as well. And that it won't only climb. As you can see, Bitcoin's prices go up and down quite volatile. I think ultimately central bank digital currencies will have a real role to play in enabling the digital ecosystem that consumers are migrating towards. So somewhere over the next few years, some countries are already adopting them, others need to get there. What we have done as a company is we have laid out certain principles. First principle, it must be stable. So the consumer must be protected. Second, it must meet all regulatory and compliance rules in a country. A currency, if it does not meet the needs of the country's government, that is not acceptable. And third, it must have protections for the consumer. Consumers are used, when they pay money today, they are used to being protected from fraud. They are used to having chargeback rights. They are used to having dispute settlement rights. They are used to data privacy. They think all this when they make their payment. Cryptocurrencies have to satisfy those needs. If you satisfy those needs, we will do business with you. We already enable some cryptocurrencies to be converted to fiat currencies and run on our network. We're examining other cryptocurrencies to run on our network directly if they meet these criteria. And we are working with central bank digital currencies in a number of countries to enable them. Our company is today the single largest holder of patents in the space, in the payments industry. So, we are putting our money where our mouth is, right? So, investing in it.
Before I get to my final question, I have another question for you. What really keeps you up at night?
Two things mostly. One is everything to do with cybersecurity. I think that for the world to become more digital, for the world to become more electronic, for the world to prosper from the Internet of Things, and for the Internet of Things to enable the unbelievable visions of medical care, education, access to products that we think it can provide, that all depends on trust, Dinesh. And if cybersecurity breaches, and you can see ransomware attacks all over the world, you can see people breaching companies for data. If those continue, trust will evaporate. And if trust evaporates, people will not adopt this. And so my belief is that cybersecurity and therefore trust is really important. And right now, cybersecurity and ransomware is like the coronavirus pandemic. People still are not taking it seriously enough. In the early days of the pandemic, they did not. They all thought it would go away. Now we are all taking it very seriously. Well, let's not do that with cybersecurity. Let's take it seriously right from the beginning and work hard on it.
Great points. Finally, my final question to you is, what is your message to the regulators and in general to retail investors going forward?
Well, it depends what perspective. I think if the perspective is around investing, my view is that you should be confident about the fact that the world economy will come out of this. I think central banks and regulators are actually doing a terrific job of navigating the fiscal and monetary policy challenges of the last year. Now, some countries have a bigger war chest, they can do more. Others have less money in the bank, they can do less. So while they are trying and they're doing well, we need to find a way to create global cooperation where countries that don't have the same ability to have the same fiscal and monetary depth are assisted by global institutions. Otherwise, we will end up with a further inequality in the system. And that, to me, Dinesh, is not acceptable. So my advice is be confident, but be compassionate.
Thank you. Thank you, Ajay. It was great talking to you, and I look forward to welcome you in Sri Lanka at some point. Thank you very much.
I would look forward to it. Thank you very much. Good luck and be well and stay safe.
Thank you.